Welcome to the Way podcast on FM 91.7 WHUS stores at the top of the hour. I'm your host, Bill Trofesky, and for more, be sure to go to podcasttheway.com. And today's topic, existential therapy, philosophy, and psychotherapy with my guest, Adam Godwin. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me, Bill.
Thanks for coming out. You have a course out on Udemy about this very topic, correct?
Yes, that's right. It's aimed at a postgraduate level and of particular interest to those who work in mental health professions, but also anyone with a lay interest in existentialism or anyone who's having an existential crisis themselves, perhaps. I think it's a generally interesting topic, and not many people know about this approach to therapy, so good to learn a bit more about it.
Sounds good. And where does your knowledge come from? How are you able to talk about this topic?
Well, funnily enough, I was first introduced to existential psychotherapy when I was only about 18 years old. One of my favorite teachers who taught me philosophy and English literature recommended a book to me, and it was Existential Psychotherapy by a fantastic author called Irvin Yalom. And it really struck a chord with me and had a massive effect on my life. And I later went on to study psychology and philosophy at an undergraduate level, and then went on to get a master's in philosophy. And eventually I became a philosophy teacher in high schools. And around the time I was doing my master's, actually, that teacher took his own life. And when I was making this course, I felt it was a little bit of an homage to him, a bit of a tribute to him, because he had a big influence on the way I thought, and on the way I look at psychology and human life, actually. But unfortunately, the ideas couldn't really save his life, and he had suffered with bipolar for a long time, and eventually it unfortunately defeated him. But that's another story. But yes, so I thought I'd make this course about it.
Okay, sounds good. And before we go any deeper, what is existentialism?
So existentialism is a movement in continental philosophy. It really started with Kierkegaard in the middle of the 19th century, and fundamentally, as the name suggests, it's interested in human existence. It's interested in ontology, which is the study of the nature of being and what it means to be a human being. But it's also interested in the human condition and the challenges that arise naturally from being a human being, things like death and meaninglessness, our isolation in the world, and also the challenges that come from our freedom, our ability to make choices, and the responsibility that implies, and the need for us to take responsibility in life before we can be fully free. So it's not just a kind of dry philosophy. It's also very much interested in how we should live in the world, how we should respond to these challenges of the human condition. And it's a movement in philosophy that came about during a time when religion was losing a lot of its authority. The scientific materialist worldview was starting to really take off and impose itself on the way people thought and viewed themselves. And the early existential philosophers identified that this would create certain challenges. They called it existential angst, a kind of anxiety that is produced by this new lack of direction and lack of religious authority. And that's really the background of it. Some of the philosophers people might have heard of that can be called existentialists are Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Sartre. Also, it's a theory that's heavily influenced by phenomenologists such as Heidegger and Husserl, and to a lesser extent Hegel. I think that's a pretty good summary of it. Yes.
Sounds good. You said Nietzsche. I thought he founded nihilism.
From a certain point of view, he was a nihilist, but he certainly has some existential ideas. He said that we should become who we are. And he also said this fantastic quote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." So he was one of the earlier philosophers to identify the importance of meaning and purpose in human life. Yes.
Didn't he say there was no meaning in life though? Wasn't that the meaning of life?
Not necessarily. I mean, he spoke about aesthetic regard, for example. He said, "I know of no better life purpose than to perish in attempting the great and the impossible." So there's this idea of rebellion. I think he's also an existential philosopher in as much as he's very much a rebellious thinker. He asks that we oppose conformity to the herd and herd morality. But this question of meaning in life is perhaps premised on a kind of nihilism. Most existential philosophers and the great existential psychologists like Yalom premise their theory on the idea that life has no given objective meaning or purpose or direction, and instead we have to create meaning, purpose, value, or direction, or at least determine which activities in our life produce a subjective sense of meaning and purpose and value. And I think Nietzsche would probably go on with that. He wasn't a defeatist, but yes, in a way a nihilist for sure. Yes.
Okay. I just did a episode about 2 episodes ago on Stoicism. Mm-hmm. And they sound similar. What's the difference between the two?
What is the difference between the two? Oh, that's a very good question. I'm not sure I can give a particularly strong answer to it because I'm not an expert in Stoicism. I would say one fundamental difference is that Stoicism, as I understand it, tends to be fairly materialistic in terms of its understanding of the human being, whereas existentialism tends to emphasize the subjective. Because of its roots in phenomenology, it's focused very much on the first-person lived experience. And I think one of the most important things we can take from existentialism and existential psychology is to really get in touch with who we are as human subjects. We seem to live in an age where objectification of others is very normal, but also, perhaps more disturbingly, people understand themselves as objects in the world. They identify with their bodies, and to tie this in with mental health, when people have challenges in life or experience suffering, they try to understand that suffering in terms of themselves as an object. So if a person is suffering very deeply, they might label that as depression, and they might blame their body. They might say there's a malfunction in my bodily mechanisms, my neurotransmitters, that causes my depression. I would say perhaps a different focus would be in the existential tradition and perspective is on the role of choice, the role of our own responsibility for our situation and our behaviors. And perhaps Stoicism could be contrast with existentialism on this front. I think Stoicism tends to advocate a kind of hardy resilience in the face of challenging circumstances, which is similar to existentialism in that we should definitely bear some of the negative aspects, so-called, of the human condition. But existentialism also advocates a massive taking of responsibility for our choices and our own ability to create our lives and shape our destiny, as opposed to just bear with it.
You mentioned people with depression, and they say it's a problem, like a bodily problem. Well, my friends just graduated with a psychology degree, and he told me one of the things he learned in his courses were that pills, like, I'm not going to say they're bad, but they're not, like, perfect, because they're kind of just, like, they tell your brain to release this chemical or something like that. But he told me there's a lot more to it than just the pill treating depression. It's not like the perfect be-all.
Absolutely. And it's not, I don't want to represent any extreme views here. There's certainly a usefulness to medication in some circumstances. But if you have an individual who's feeling depressed and you look at their life and they're working a job that feels meaningless and alienating. They're in an unhappy relationship, perhaps with an abusive partner. There's something, I think, very dubious about simply about saying, this is a bodily problem, a neurological problem, when clearly there are situational factors that person has a role potentially in perpetuating, that they could change and it would be a bit better. And I think the analogy I use with a purely physicalist psychology and approach to suffering is a bit like if you put a dog inside a cage and the dog starts barking, and you ask yourself, well, why is this dog barking? And you do all the blood tests and you notice that the cortisol levels are increased. And then you say, oh, right, he's barking because the cortisol levels are increased. And if I can now give him the pill to lower the cortisol, he'll stop barking. When, of course, the actual problem is the cage. And the metaphor of the cage is quite relevant to existential psychology, because many people do live in cages of inauthenticity and a cage of failed responsibility. And sometimes other people put us in those cages, but quite often, actually, we play a role in putting ourselves in cages and keeping ourselves in cages. And authenticity is a huge concept that I forgot to mention in my outline of existentialism. But the idea that we need to make authentic choices based on our own values and judgments instead of simply conforming to the values and beliefs and judgments of others is hugely important to, I would say, pretty much all existentialists, but especially Sartre, one of the later ones.
Authenticity, like as the host of this show, I can't be phony. I got to talk like I actually talk.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. Don't be phony actually pretty much sums it up. And, as much as Kevin Spacey has fallen out of favor due to his misdemeanors in the past, I think his film American Beauty is a fantastic representation of authenticity and of the so-called existential crisis and of a midlife crisis in which an individual moves from a very inauthentic and phony life, which is kind of empty. At the beginning, he says, I feel so sedated in this life. And he moves towards a much more authentic way of being. And perhaps, and I only really thought about this whilst making the course, because I did an episode in the course on existential heroes, of which I consider Lester Burnham to be one of them. One of the interesting things about that film is that he gets killed at the end of it. Sorry, spoiler alert. He gets killed at the end of it by one of the many inauthentic people that surrounds him. His closet homosexual neighbor ends up killing him. But there's a kind of montage that reveals that basically everybody around him wanted him dead. Everyone had a motive to kill him because they themselves were inauthentic. And it's a very interesting thing to consider that a part of the cage of inauthenticity we live in is actually the inauthenticity of other people and the pressure that comes from other people to maintain inauthentic behaviors and just go along with the norms and values of society and what's expected of us.
When he died, did he say "et tu, Brutus"? Because that would be a great line for him to say.
He did not. I know this because I can almost completely quote that film. I've watched it far too many times. Yes. No, he didn't, but you're right.
Yeah, it's like a real-life version of that with the Caesar.
Yes.
So you mentioned it a lot in your video, what's existential therapy?
So existential therapy is an approach to therapy, and many existential therapists prefer the term existential therapy over existential psychotherapy because it does refer to the whole life. It's not just about the mind. If you look at an approach to psychotherapy such as CBT, it's very much about how the person is thinking. As existential therapy looks at the bigger picture, at how the person is living, the way they're relating to different aspects of their lives. Now, it's an approach to therapy that's obviously informed by existential philosophy. And this means that the goals of existential psychotherapy or existential therapy are a little bit different to other approaches to therapy. Again, if you think about CBT or even Freudian therapy, the goals are quite clearly emotional. You might be reducing unhappiness or making people more happy, and they may also be in relation to specific mental health conditions or illnesses. And an interesting thing about existential therapy is that it hopes to depathologize what it views as quite normal, quite universal aspects of the human condition and the suffering that that implies. And it's quite, I suppose, opposed to the unnecessary labeling of mental health conditions, or at least it tries to see that purely in pragmatic terms. So it's quite important that people don't see themselves as a schizophrenic, for example, more a person who has a label of schizophrenia. But so what are the goals of existential therapy? More to do with, as I said, authenticity. The pursuit of meaning is massively important. The idea that meaninglessness is an emotional state that is to be overcome, a challenge that we need to overcome. But it's also very much interested in getting people to identify the choices they make and the role that those choices play in creating their suffering and in creating their situation, and helping people to explore choices and take responsibility for those choices, to assume responsibility for those choices, and not to defer to purely naturalistic explanations of their situation. Or I think one of the most important things people could take from this podcast is to think about the ways in which they and other people deny the extent of their own freedom. They pretend that things that are choices are not choices. And if I can quote Nietzsche again, the most common sort of lie is that by which a man deceives himself. I think Kierkegaard also warned that self-deception is the greatest threat, the worst kind of deception. And existential psychology often looks at the role of self-deception, and it also looks at the payoffs that people get by maintaining their dysfunctional lives. So if I could give an example, say a person is in a highly dysfunctional relationship, they have a choice to leave. They could leave. Why is it they choose to stay? An existential psychologist might explore reasons around existential isolation, the fact that people fear that isolation of being alone and the anxiety that that creates. And I would say another way of understanding existential therapy, instead of focusing on the goals, is to focus on the challenges. And the psychologist Irvin Yalom puts forward a very useful framework to explore this. He says that there are four main existential givens in life, four things about the human condition that quite inevitably and naturally create a kind of anxiety for us. And the way that we deal with that anxiety is hugely important in mental health issues. Those four givens are death, isolation, meaninglessness, and this challenge of freedom and responsibility. And the coping mechanisms we generate to deal with the anxiety those four givens produce are often at the root cause of what then becomes labeled as a mental health condition.
Got it. You said choices can lead to anxiety and whatnot. You know determinism, right?
Oh, yes. big fan in a way. And yeah, I kind of was afraid you were going to ask me about that, actually. At so many points in my life, I've argued for determinism. And existentialism rejects determinism outright. Certainly, it rejects hard determinism. And
my guest 2 days ago, he was Stoicism, or 2 episodes, not 2 days. He was saying the two go hand in hand. Like, it's weird to hear you say the opposite.
Well, I think the reason the existentialists deny determinism is because they're rooted in phenomenology. And from a kind of phenomenological point of view, which focuses on our subjective experience, we just have such a vivid and rich experience of making choices And that experience can count as a kind of evidence in our formation of an anti-deterministic worldview. And I suppose an existentialist might say it's a choice. You can choose to adopt a deterministic worldview, or you can choose to focus on a more metaphysically libertarian perspective. I think there is a kind of pragmatic issue in that you could say, in the face of this doubt, this debate which has been going on for thousands of years about free will versus determinism, there is a pragmatic value in assuming responsibility, assuming that we do make free choices. And I would add that even if in fact it is highly deterministic, if a person comes to a therapy session and you explore the choices that they appear to have in life, and they go on to make one of those choices based on that conversation, from a certain point of view, it's all determined cause and effect. But from another point of view, discussing things in those terms of choice and free choice becomes a useful process, even if it is actually just determined. Yes.
Got it. You say existentialism, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the idea that kind of nothing matters, or you create your own meaning, something similar to that, right?
Certainly the last bit. Certainly the creating your own meaning. And that's opposed to the idea that anyone else can give you meaning, and that includes God, actually. That even the existentialists who were theists, such as Soren Kierkegaard and Martin Buber, were quite negative about organized religion and the inauthenticity that produces. But yes, it is definitely about creating your own meaning in the face of an absurd and meaningless universe, and not shying away from that lack of objective meaning and pretending otherwise.
From watching your video, one of the previews for your course, I saw there's 3 ways to find meaning. Like you just said, religion, create your own meaning, and one was accept meaningless. So wouldn't accepting determinism sort of be like accepting meaningless?
I'm not sure necessarily. It could be that this is both determined and, I mean, it, the more I think about this problem of objective value and meaning, the more I feel that I can't even imagine what objective value would be. To me, nihilism is just such a given. The idea that values are inherently constructed and that a bar of gold and a lump of rock have the same value in reality. If you remove the fictions of the human mind, to me, this is so obviously true. And the idea that there is an objective meaning or purpose or value, I've never really been able to get my head around, and I'm not ashamed to say it. I know some people find the kind of biological account to be convincing and satisfying, but I've never really been able to fully be satisfied by that account myself. No, I don't know how I would fully answer your question as a result of that. If there was a God, maybe there could be some objective purpose and meaning, and maybe it could be determined, because of course you have these arguments in the philosophy of religion that if God knows everything because he's omniscient, then he must know the future. And if he knows the future, then that is essentially determinism. And this creates all sorts of terrible conclusions, results, consequences, because if that's true, then it means that whether I'm destined for heaven or hell was essentially set in motion by God before I was even born, which makes the whole thing awfully sadistic if I do end up in hell. Yes. So
Hey, thanks for the setup, man.
Yeah, exactly. He's kind of a cosmic BDSM master more than anything at that point. I think more than a loving, omnibenevolent God. Yes.
Isn't that what you said very similar to? Isn't there a paradox some old philosopher said? Like, if God is this, then that means this, then that means this, then that means this, like all the way to sort of create a paradox, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I forget which one it was. Might have been Seneca the Younger, because he often has some nice, solid anti-theist arguments. But it could be the problem of evil is often expressed like that. If God is all loving and powerful, and there's evil, then he must not know about it. If he's all powerful and all knowing, then he can't be omnibenevolent because there's suffering and this kind of thing. So I think you're talking about one of the formulations of the problem of metaphysical evil.
And I think the Christian response was something along the lines, since he is so powerful and stuff, he's able to set it up like that in a way that works. So that is like an outlet to the paradox, I believe. But there was that paradox.
Well, there were all sorts of attempts to resolve the problem of evil. They're called theodicies. And there's actually a very beautiful atheistic theodicy from Nietzsche, which I could briefly explain. So it is very good. He says, analyzing the world in terms of pleasure and pain is kind of infantile. It's a bit childish and anthropocentric and self-centered. And actually, instead, isn't it true that life is an aesthetic phenomenon? We can see life as an aesthetic process. And when you look at the world through an aesthetic lens, suffering loses its negativity because of tragedy and because of comedy. He wrote a book called The Birth of Tragedy, and he said that tragedy is what allows us to give value to suffering. If Romeo and Juliet hadn't ended with their mutual suicides and terrible sadness, it would not really be a particularly valuable work of art. And the suffering inherent to our lives has a kind of aesthetic, tragic beauty to it that can help us deal with the amount of suffering. So it's quite a novel theodicy, quite a novel response to the problem of evil. And even though, Nietzsche famously said God is dead, and is in many ways an atheist, but in some other texts he says some fairly theistic things. He said in The Birth of Tragedy that nature is the only one true artist, and all human artists are merely agents of this one true artist. I'm paraphrasing him, so any philosophical pedants out there must forgive me, but there's something almost theistic about that, kind of Spinozan conception of God at that point, of nature as God, that I think Nietzsche might be more sympathetic to. I think he was mainly rallying about the kind of childish and reductionist Judeo-Christian conception of God as a kind of father figure who will reward slaves for their poverty and ensure the world is fair and just and this kind of thing.
You mentioned a tragedy a minute ago, and one of the things I found with existentialism is they like the existential crisis, or they like the midlife crisis.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it's something that makes it a bit different, is that the negative emotions generated by the existential givens, such as death, are not something to be denied. They're actually massive opportunities that we can make use of. So once upon a time, I was a teacher. I taught in what you would call middle school, what we call secondary school, and I would ask my students, I was teaching religious studies and philosophy, and say we're doing a lesson on death. I would say to these 13-year-olds, why would we think about death? Like, what are the benefits of thinking about death and facing up to our mortality instead of denying it somehow or other? And they could come up with the most impressive lists of benefits that we get from it. So one benefit, if we think about our death, when we think about how short our lives are, is that it gives us a powerful motive to make the most of the time we have, to savor the time that we have. And when we think about the mortality of those around us, it can help us appreciate them. And, I say this to my listeners, I hope you're paying attention. Just think about the people in your lives and the fact that one day, everyone you know will be gone for good. And if you start deluding yourself with the idea that you're going to see them again in some magical fairy tale kingdom once you die, you're missing a massive opportunity to really appreciate them and savor them and the time you have with them in this mortal coil. And the other thing is, when we think about our own death, and the fact that it can happen at any moment, and that even if we have a long life, it's actually still a very short life. Thinking about death on a regular basis and facing that anxiety, using that anxiety, can help us see through the trivial concerns and see the bigger picture and get a lot more out of life. And that's a really interesting thing with death anxiety, which is that we fear death the most when we're not fully living. And so death anxiety can give us this powerful motive to really live fully. And just to give a very quick example of that, isn't it true that you would much rather die in a plane crash after your 2-week holiday than in a plane crash on the way to your 2-week holiday? The way that we've been living and the way that we choose to live has a massive impact on how we feel about death. But yes, you're right. Existential angst is seen as a warning sign that we should change something about either our behavior, our choices, or simply the way we're thinking about our situation and relating to it. Yes.
You said are we more likely to die on the way there versus the way back? I mean, wouldn't it be safer to just not even go on the plane?
Well, that's another important point, which is that the fear of death can often create a prison for us and stop us living fully. And this is something that Irvin Yalom talks a great deal about, is that the fear of death often leads people towards lives based around comfort and security. But because they're dedicated merely to comfort and security instead of full and authentic living, it actually simply exacerbates the death anxiety. So the more you try to escape death, the less fully you live and the more death anxiety you feel.
So by seeing death as this sort of be all, but also accepting it allows you to enjoy life more, make most of living in the moment, sort of.
Absolutely. And that's especially true if we contrast it to the ways that people try to deny the reality of death. And Irvin Yalom talks about 2 master delusions that people cling to in order to deny the reality of death to them, and crucially to avoid or try to avoid the consciousness of the anxiety that death produces. And those 2 coping mechanisms, and we might want to all think about whether these are relevant to our own lives, whether we do this or not, are the delusion of an ultimate rescuer, which can take the form of a personal God, but it can also take the form of a relationship, the idea of finding a dominant partner who can protect us and save us from our fate somehow. But the other coping mechanism, which I suspect might be more common, especially amongst the non-religious listeners, is the delusion of inviolability, of specialness, of invincibility. Somehow death happens to other people, but it won't ever happen to me. We've perhaps all been guilty of this year with this pandemic. We, on some level, tell ourselves, well, I'll be one of the lucky ones who will be asymptomatic and it won't hit me too hard. And of course, that's not really something we can be sure of, and it's mainly a way of denying our anxiety and trying to avoid it. And we could also think about how people get lost in what you could call immortality projects and death denial projects. And this is something that the sociologist Ernst Becker wrote about in his book, The Denial of Death, that a lot of the things people do with their time are kind of dysfunctional, delusional immortality projects where we make out that we're some kind of hero that's going to overcome death. Yeah, he actually said pretty much everything that people do is a way of avoiding death, whether it's the artist who tries to attain immortality through his art, whether it's wars. In a war, it's often between 2 religions, and religions are death denial strategies that are mutually exclusive. So he suggested a lot of wars are actually ways of trying to deny the reality of death and protect death denial projects. Even, our engagement in capitalist, consumerist society, we cling to these material possessions that will outlive us. And in that sense, perhaps we're trying to take part in some immortality project. And even more fundamentally than that, this genetic game of I must have lots of kids, I must reproduce. And because I've reproduced and passed my genes on, I am now in some sense immortal. To me, this is just pure delusion in terms of an attempt to try to deny the reality of our inevitable death.
You said earlier on sort of dismissing a savior, like dismissing a god or something like that. Well, first, did I hear that right? Yeah.
Kind of, yeah. The ultimate rescuer, which is sometimes a god, yes. It can be a god, usually is really, I think, for a lot of people. Yeah.
I don't know whether God is real or not. I don't know whether any other religion is accurate or not. But what if, say, God is real? How can you say, like, dismiss him? Because then doesn't that go against, like, the religion?
Well, I mean, you could say that about any religion, of course. What if Zeus isn't real? What if Thor isn't real, or Wotan? But I'm determined that this isn't going to become an atheist edgelord kind of discussion. I'm agnostic myself, and I'm the first to admit that we don't actually know. And I suppose uncertainty is another one of the existential givens. We don't really know that there is or is not someone looking out for us. And in that sense, we probably shouldn't assume that we're going to be saved from death, when death itself is something that we can clearly see before our very eyes occurring. When it comes to life after death, I'm fundamentally agnostic. I recognize that a person who clings to the idea that there's nothing is often engaged in self-deception just as much as the person who clings to the idea that there is something. And I know there's a famous Zen master who was asked, what happens when you die? And he simply replied, I don't know, because I haven't died yet. And I think that's the only logical response. I think, I mentioned earlier that people mistake themselves for their bodies, and they see themselves as objects. And I think that's a very dubious position. And because of that, I think the idea that definitely nothing will follow experientially after our bodies cease to function is an assumption. It's not a certainty philosophically.
Speaking of people avoiding death, it was on the news a bit prior. If I'm saying this right, if you're under the age 40, there's a 50% chance you'll be able to live like past 100, but stay young. Like in science, they're finding out ways to actually like stop aging.
Or certainly delay it. And I'm kind of a bit of a Buddhist, and I do think those four truths which motivated him, disease, old age, and death, they're probably something that human beings are going to be dealing with for a long, long time yet. And until we work out some way of uploading our consciousness into technology, I don't think we will solve it. I'm not actually entirely sure that immortality is as desirable as people might think, given, just because we fear death doesn't mean that immortality can be particularly pleasant. And I was thinking recently about vampires. Everyone loves a good vampire story, but actually the vampire represents a very interesting existential thought experiment, which is asking what are the moral limits that we would be prepared to go to in order to be immortal. Would you want to be immortal if it meant killing a new person every day, for example? And I think most of us would say probably not. And because of that, actually, there are things that we all value much more than simply living a long life. And one of those things is living a moral life. And you asked before about whether existentialism is nihilistic. I think one thing worth pointing out is that existentialism usually advocates a deeply moral form of life. It's just that that morality has to be one's own code, one's own authentic system of ethics, not simply conformity to the moral norms that one is given.
Also, say you could live forever and 100 years go by, okay, another 100, another 1,000, another 10,000. By like at least some point out there, you kind of have to be bored with life. You kind of have to have seen every single city. You probably have to have seen every country, probably done everything you've wanted to do.
Yes. Well, and I'm not one of these people who likes to pretend that life is good. I know it makes
You
you
don't
look
like those
good.
shirts, the life is good shirts?
No, I really don't. And I don't like the reason people wear them either, because the idea that if I go around saying life is good, it's really just playing along with the social status game. I'm a massive fan of philosophical pessimism, especially Schopenhauer, and especially in Buddhism. And the starting point of those philosophies is actually that life involves a great deal of suffering throughout. And that's actually, even in the best times of life, there is a trace of suffering, a trace of discontentment. And the moments of peace and contentment in life are actually quite rare. And I think it's very interesting when we look at Eastern religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism. The ultimate goal is not to be reincarnated again and again and again into different, perhaps better human lives. The ultimate goal is to escape that cycle of existence, of birth and rebirth somehow. Because they recognize that actually life is very difficult. It's not an inherently good thing. And if anyone's interested in philosophical pessimism, I recommend a book called A Conspiracy Against Mankind. I'm just going to look up the author very quickly. It's well worth a read. The Conspiracy Against the Human Race by Thomas Ligotti. And it's a fantastic overview of philosophical pessimism. And, people might think, oh, I'm not going to read that. It will make me very miserable. But I actually find there's a strange joy that comes from reading philosophical pessimism, a strange honesty to it. Quite funny, actually. I think there's a humor to it, because a lot of the truths that are expressed are so taboo that you're not allowed to talk about what a rotten thing life can be, not just for the worst off, but actually just for a normal human being. It can be a very difficult thing. And there's a lovely honesty about the book, and I do recommend it.
I guess the yang to the yin. Why?
Yes.
But why not have an optimistic or even a realist approach?
Well, I think realism is the word there. And I think, there is room for optimism. Now, what happened with the development of existential psychology is kind of in its recent form, it got developed into positive psychology. It got mixed with positive psychology, into what is called positive psychology 2.0 by a guy called David Wong. And he actually refers to the yin yang, and he refers to the need to have a balance. And he talks about how positive psychology has its own limits if you don't acknowledge these negative things. And remember before I spoke about how existentialism places some value on existential angst. And it's important not just to deny the usefulness of those things. But you're right, I think it is about finding a balance. And I think realism, as you say, should be about incorporating both the opposites of good and bad, and suffering and pleasure, the light and the dark, but also seeing the thing which goes beyond good and evil, to quote Nietzsche again. And I would say that the thing that does go beyond good and evil is us, is human subjects who perceive this world of opposites. The yin-yang occurs within our minds, and our minds, in that sense, are really, truthfully, beyond good and evil.
You mentioned something earlier about people having kids and trying to live on through that. What was that bit again?
Well, I think the the thinking behind, I mean, let's start with a basic question. Why do people have children instead of adopting them? And I actually think that usually the reasons behind that are highly inauthentic and highly questionable. And I know that's going to be an unpopular view. It's probably going to annoy many of your listeners. But it seems to me that the two reasons people choose to have their own children instead of adopting them, where they have that choice, is firstly, to please their parents, to live up to various social expectations and pressures around them. But secondly, it's to take part in a kind of self-delusional idea about immortality, that if I reproduce, my genetic survival will imply that I am somehow immortal. But I would say this is a very questionable thing to believe, because even after the first cycle, only 50% of your genes roughly are going to be manifest in your children. And then if they reproduce, which you cannot be sure they will, it's only going to be 25% of your genetics. And within a few generations, the idea that there's much of you left is obviously not very plausible. But even if somehow you were to clone yourself, I say, you're only really cloning your genetic code, your body. And as an individual subjective experiencer of life, that is going to end, regardless of whether I clone myself, whether I'm Genghis Khan and I have 13 million descendants or whatever it is. You cannot escape death. And I think the attempts to do so often do more harm than good. I mean, I looked into it, and there is some statistical evidence actually that people who have children and choose to become parents are more likely to be depressed than people who simply choose to remain child-free. And of course, in our society, if you have children, it does imply a lot of work. It does imply quite an imposition on your ability to live a free life and an authentic life. Like in the UK, I think the average child costs £200,000 from the age 0 to 18. Now, if you're trapped in some meaningless, alienating job that doesn't allow you to feel a particularly meaningful and authentic existence, well, the choice to have that child may well simply make your life even worse and give you fewer options to make it more meaningful.
One of the things I find interesting about having a kid to try and live on is there's actually a rapper for the listeners too, if anybody knows of Logic. And one of his songs is called Till the End, at the end of his Under Pressure album. And what he does is he throws in a clip of some old philosopher, I forget who he was. And he talks about how in today's day and age, a lot of people want to be something big. Like he says, they want to live forever. They want to have their dream job, but they're not able to do it because of just life gets in the way. So they have a kid, and then they tell that kid, hey, grow up, be what you want to be, follow your dream. And then the kid grows up, doesn't follow the dream, has another kid, tells that kid, hey, be what you want to be, follow your dream. And it becomes this consistent loop that never gets to its destination. Nobody ever actually follows their dream because they keep finding satisfaction in the kid. Yeah.
And again, if you believe that life is good, then surely creating life is a good thing. But if, like me, you're a little bit more skeptical about that claim, life is going to be difficult for those kids who may well just end up working in Walmart for their entire lives, feeling quite unhappy about that fact. And this is something, again, that book, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, talks about this. He says at one point, every parent has blood on their hands, which is a great thing to think about, the kind of moral consequences of having a child. And that's assuming the child is a healthy and happy one. But let's face it, a lot of people are born into bodies that make a happy life very difficult, very painful lives. Their bodies perhaps have diseases or they're prone to mental illness. And the many flavors of human suffering are, I think, infinite, and the depths endless. So it's a huge moral choice to have children. And I know there's a lot of debate amongst Buddhists about whether having children is a good idea or not, But I don't think it's a coincidence that so many of these Buddhists who take a vow to pursue the truth and to end suffering end up going to monasteries to live lives as celibate monks who do not reproduce. And looking at the story of the Buddha himself, even he went back to, he did have a son, but after he was enlightened, he went back and recruited his son into monkhood and thus made sure his bloodline ended. And one might think this might be because he recognized that if we live like animals, we will suffer like animals. And if we pretend we don't have a choice and that we have to do what animals do and just live for our genetic survival, if we do that, we will be taking part in a process that will cause suffering, will create an ocean of suffering in every case. And, you know, I know someone who recently had a baby, and I look at the baby crying, and I think, well, this human being is suffering. It's born with so many needs, and in a way, those needs are never going to be met for long. As soon as they are met, another need will spring up, and so the suffering goes on. And Schopenhauer said at one point, from desire, I rise to satisfaction, and from satisfaction, I fall back down to desire. This is a very Buddhist idea. And I should say at this point that I'm probably digressing quite a lot from existential psychology and therapy and philosophy on it with this pessimism. Existential psychology and philosophy isn't necessarily as pessimistic as I am. I'm simply someone who made an excellent course on the topic, more than a good representative of an existentialist, I think. But yes.
Okay, then. Actually, before I bring back to existentialism, you say, yeah, like there's a lot of suffering for the new kid and whatnot in life in general. But I mean, I'm still happy to be alive. And I think most people would be. So isn't it still worth it to, exist?
Maybe. This is a part of the conspiracy that Ligotti speaks about, is that we all have to say that. It's kind of a taboo. And if someone starts saying, oh, God, why was I born? This is a constant hassle and mither. Well, no one's really going to want to hang out and be your friend or listen to your radio show anymore if you're too negative. So we kind of all have to play along a little bit. In truth, if you and I had not been born, we obviously wouldn't care about it very much. We would be in this hypothetical, non-existent state, and we would have avoided a lot of struggle and work and hassle. And yes, we wouldn't care otherwise. And
yeah, I wouldn't have failed my exam about a few weeks ago.
Exactly. You wouldn't have had to bother with all of that. And, how old are you, Bill?
I'm 21.
Oh, God, you've got so much time ahead of you. But a lot of that time is going to be spent doing things you'd probably rather not do, like working this and that job and this kind of thing. And I don't know, I'm not going to patronize. I'm only 34 myself. And frankly, Bill, I've had a fairly easy life. I have very little cause for concern. I've never had, for example, any serious health challenges, but both you and I have those joys to look forward to later in life, and there's probably not too much escaping them. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's good to try to be positive about life, I suppose, if it helps. But a part of me, as a philosopher, I've always been motivated by the pursuit of the truth. And I think if you're going to be serious about pursuing the truth philosophically, you have to accept that some parts of the truth aren't going to be very nice, and you might not like them. There's no point being a philosopher if we only cling to the theories and ideas that we like or make us feel good. And there's a lot to be gained, I think, from facing up to the sufferings of life. As in Buddhism, it's not just, oh, life is suffering, and so, give up. It's life is suffering, and so we need to think very deeply about how to reduce that suffering and how we can live together in such a way that we don't create more unnecessary suffering. And to go back to that quote I mentioned before from Nietzsche, if you have a why as to why you should live, you can deal with anyhow. So you can deal with the sufferings of life if you do find a strong sense of purpose and meaning, or a strong cause to live for, a reason for living.
Okay. All right. Bring it back to existentialism. And speaking of the sufferings of life, one of the quotes I saw you mention through your class was you said rock bottom is a moment of truth. Why is that?
Rock bottom is a moment of truth. Now, I think that was talking about how we cope with our things. And so maybe it's best to use an example of that to illustrate the point. Now, one of the greatest existential psychologists was a guy called Viktor Frankl, and he established a particular form of existential psychology called logotherapy. And it's very much focused on the pursuit of meaning in life. And one of his big ideas, one of the ideas to take from this podcast, I should say, is the idea of an existential void. And the existential void is the negative emotions we feel when we fail to find a meaningful use of our time, when we fail to find a sense of value and purpose in our lives. Now, what can happen with the existential void is that people try to escape that anxiety. They become, what he calls the will to meaning becomes frustrated. And in order to deal with the pain, they try to fill the void with hedonism, with drugs, or with sex addiction, something like that. So, of course, these things don't really work, or they might produce a kind of temporary sense of meaning that fades quickly and then needs to be replaced by something even worse. And so what can happen is a kind of a cycle of ever more extreme attempts to avoid the fundamental existential issue, which is the lack of a given meaning in life. And eventually the hitting rock bottom occurs when you realize that nothing is going to help you escape that. And because you realize nothing's going to help you escape it, then you have to face the root problem, which is the lack of a given meaning in life. And a similar thing, and so in that sense, it is a moment of truth, hitting rock bottom. Another example might be the attempts to avoid death by pretending that you're somehow invincible or special. Maybe you're a workaholic, maybe again you try to escape these existential anxieties by getting involved in drug addiction. And of course, people involved in drug addiction, because it's a high-risk behavior, that is itself an expression of a sense of invincibility or inviolability. But of course, it doesn't really help in resolving the fundamental issue. And when the coping strategies fail and you hit rock bottom, you're forced to face the truth of mortality. And for some drug addicts, this might be, for example, when they witness one of their friends dying from an overdose, they see the futility of trying to escape death in that way. And they have a very real confrontation with the thing that they're actually trying to avoid.
I saw it's recommended to find either one of three meanings: religion, create your own meaning to life, or embrace meaningless. But when you reach rock bottom, like you just said, you could either find one of those meanings and sort of break free or get out of rock bottom, or you can also just go down a pit you mentioned where it gets even worse.
You could do.
Yeah, so that's like the flaw of the three ones. Like say, embrace meaningless, you said you can risk moral nihilism and become reckless and harmful. No, disagree?
No, I do agree that for each of them, there are risks, actually.
Religion, I had a leap of faith. They forget what they're doing and become dogmatic nuts. And create
exactly. Religion creates often quite a limited set of possibilities in life. It's fundamentally perhaps involves a degree of self-deception, but also it often implies this inauthenticity of living by other people's rules, living by other people's values. It's not coming from you anymore. You're just going along with other people's systems. It's, I think, certainly true that the existentialists would advocate the second of those options, which is creating a sense of meaning yourself. And I think the main limitation for that, or at least personally, the thing I've always struggled with that is simply the knowledge that it is my own creation. It's kind of almost arbitrary, perhaps. I have always been a fan of making peace with the lack of objective meaning and almost celebrating the freedom that that gives. And I think for me, morality is probably more about things like conscience and empathy, kind of inherent psychological processes that I'm lucky enough to have built into me, more than necessarily a set of values that I create or internalize from other people. It's more of an in the now process of responding to situations, I would say, yes.
You sort of answered it right there, but a lot of people ask, what's the meaning of life? From an existential viewpoint, what do you think is the meaning of life?
To create your own meaning of life, I think, is the simplest answer to that. Or to find the behaviors and choices and activities that generate a sense of meaning in your life. And don't go chasing an objective notion of meaning. And yeah, I think that's what they would say. I think, just in my own experience, I've wasted a lot of time trying to do things that other people told me will feel meaningful, and they didn't. So I spend a lot of time working as a nurse of sorts, and I spend a lot of time working as a teacher. They were both in the public sector, so it was a fairly selfless kind of career choice. But did they provide a satisfying sense of meaning? Not really. It's actually, I find more meaning in other activities that other people probably wouldn't have recommended. It's a very subjective thing. That's what I'm trying to say. So it's good to abandon any ideas of what will make life feel meaningful to you that other people have given you. And one thing I should add to that is that throughout our lives, many people will tell us what will make life feel meaningful, and almost all of them will have an agenda behind them. So your parents will say, make us some grandchildren. It will make your life feel meaningful. Your government will say, join the army. That is a meaningful use of life. And the priest will say, join my church and worship my God. And then your life will feel meaningful. You shouldn't be surprised if you do any of those three things, you don't actually feel like your life is particularly meaningful as a result. And that's almost entirely perhaps because it's not really an authentic reflection of your own values and what subjectively will lead to a sense of meaning for you.
When you mentioned people have choices, I remember a philosophy that came up was arguably it would be better if we didn't have any choices in life, because then we wouldn't have to stress. Yeah, can you go in about that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so this is a huge part of Sartre's philosophy. And Sartre famously said that we are condemned to be free. And it's a very interesting thing to think about, because when we talk about freedom, it's such a positive word. We all love freedom, and we're always putting so much energy politically into fighting for our freedom. But we don't realize that the main threat to our freedom really comes from ourselves, and it comes from the emotional reaction we have in response to our capacity to choose. And here's why we have it, is because we have infinite choices. At any moment in our life, there is a boundlessness to the choices we have before us. I could throw this microphone through my computer screen and throw myself out the window right now. There's nothing to stop me doing that. Or I could, take up learning the piano, or do an infinite number of things. So the power of human choice is endless. But here's the catch. You can only choose one path in life. And when you choose that path, you exclude all of the other paths. And when you make a choice, that choice might be a bad choice, and you just don't know it. You don't know the consequences of it until it's too late. And so we hope to avoid that risk and that anxiety by pretending that we are not free. And Sartre calls that bad faith. And he usually talks about how we get lost in our social roles in order to pretend that we're not free. Yes. But that's the fundamental issue with our freedom. It creates this anxiety because we can only walk one path. It might be the wrong path. Much easier if we defer our responsibility onto some external agent. Might be our partner, might be society and social expectations, might be parents. I think that's very common. People just let parents make the big choices in their life. Or it might be God. Although it's worth mentioning that even within, theistic traditions, there's still a lot of choices to be made. Do I become a monk and worship God that way? Do I go the evangelical family values path? And so there's no perfect solution in attempting to avoid choice. And we shouldn't. We should be realistic, as you say, and realistic about the choices that we can make and the choices we do make in perpetuating our own suffering and the situations that lead to that suffering.
One of my theories, I don't know about over in Germany where you are, but the iPhone is very popular in America. Mm-hmm. And I think that, along with like minimalism and marketing and whatnot, is we like the iPhone so much because compared to the Android, you can't really do much. You can only do what you need or what you want, while the Android gives you all this complicated stuff that's sort of like, oh, I can do all this, but then it gets in the way. I just want the simple, my decision made for me.
I mean, I once wrote this essay. I had to write it because it was part of my degree. And the question was, is there such a thing as too much choice? And I remember one piece of research said that as soon as you give people more than 5 options, the more options you give them, the less satisfied they will be with the choice they eventually make. So if you're choosing between 3 types of cookie and you leave the shop with the one you choose, you're going to be more satisfied than had you chosen exactly the same cookies when there were 20 options. Because in the back of your mind, you're always thinking, oh God, but what about all those other flavors? You can't be so sure. So I think you're right. We like to narrow our options down and actually reduce our freedom in that sense. And I should add, as someone who's been vegetarian for like almost 18 years now, it's one of the lesser mentioned advantages to being vegetarian, which is that when you go into a restaurant, there's usually only 3 blooming options on the menu. So whatever you choose, you can be fairly confident that you've chosen the best option out of the very limited ones that you've been given. So there is that.
That makes sense. I can see that. I think I'm going to wrap this podcast up. I'm out of questions.
Thank you so much for having me. You have one more question.
Well, yes. Before we end this, what's the final message or final bit of insight you want to tell the audience?
I would say that if you're looking for an ultimate value in life, make it the truth. And that if you want to find the truth, the best way to do so is to let go of all of your cherished opinions and your delusional beliefs. Be aware of self-deception in the pursuit of the truth and be open to different ideas about what that truth is. But yes, I think that's the one thing I would like to say to listeners.
All right. Well, this is The Way Podcast. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill. It's been an absolute pleasure.
That's great to hear. And for everybody listening, again, this is 91.7 FM WHUS Stores at the top of the hour. And for more, be sure to go to podcasttheway.com. Again, podcasttheway.com for any more info, or even if you're an expert in something, send an email through the contact list. And as always, deuces.